The gunshots came before any warning, tearing through the quiet of the night and shattering the glass doors of the study. Daniel Hart dropped to the floor a second before the first bullet would have found his chest, his body moving on pure instinct built from years of watching his back. He rolled behind the heavy oak desk, his heart slamming against his ribs, his mind racing through every face he had trusted that morning. Someone in this house wanted him gone, and they had chosen tonight to make it happen. He heard footsteps outside the door, careful and deliberate, the kind of footsteps that belonged to someone who had done this before. Daniel reached for the small pistol taped beneath the desk drawer, his fingers trembling slightly, not from fear but from fury. He had built his empire from nothing, clawing his way up through a world that punished weakness and rewarded ruthlessness, and now the people closest to him were trying to erase him from it. The door creaked open. A shadow slipped inside, moving toward the desk with slow, practiced steps. Daniel held his breath, gripping the pistol, waiting for the exact moment to strike. When the shadow leaned over the desk to check if he was truly dead, Daniel surged upward and struck first, sending the intruder stumbling backward into the bookshelf. In the confusion, Daniel bolted for the hidden passage behind the fireplace, a secret exit only he and his late father had ever known about. Bullets chased him through the narrow corridor, chipping stone and wood, but none of them found their mark. By the time he reached the garage and sped away in an unmarked car, Daniel's hands were shaking uncontrollably. Not from the danger he had just escaped, but from the realization that had settled cold and heavy in his chest. This was not the work of a rival family or an outside enemy. Whoever had planned this attack knew the layout of his house, the timing of his guards, and the exact location of his study. This was someone inside his own circle. He drove for hours, taking back roads no one would think to check, until he reached a small private clinic owned by a doctor who had once owed him a great favor. The doctor patched up a shallow wound along his side and asked no questions, understanding without being told that silence was part of the payment. Daniel sat in the dim room afterward, staring at his own reflection in a cracked mirror, and for the first time in years, he felt truly alone. It was in that quiet, bitter hour that an idea began to form. If someone close to him wanted him dead, then the only way to find out who was to make them believe they had already won. If the world thought Daniel Hart was broken beyond recovery, unable to see, unable to move, unable to defend himself or his empire, then whoever had orchestrated the attack would finally feel safe enough to reveal themselves. Fear made people careless. Comfort made them confident. Confidence made them sloppy. He returned to his estate 3 days later in a wheelchair, his eyes covered with dark glasses, his hands limp in his lap. The staff gathered in the entrance hall, murmuring in hushed voices, as 2 guards wheeled him inside. His brother, Victor Hart, was the first to greet him, kneeling beside the wheelchair, with an expression of deep concern carved carefully onto his face. Daniel studied him from behind the glasses, searching for any flicker of guilt, but Victor's performance was flawless. That, in itself, told Daniel everything he needed to know. Claire Whitfield, his fiancée, arrived moments later, her heels clicking against the marble floor with unhurried elegance. She pressed a cool hand to his cheek and murmured words of comfort, yet Daniel noticed how her eyes moved past him almost immediately, calculating, already measuring what remained of value in the house, now that its owner appeared powerless. She did not know that he could see every glance, hear every whispered word, and understand every silence that followed his presence in a room. The doctor who examined him for the household, a man paid well by the family, declared that Daniel had suffered severe trauma to his spine and his optic nerves during the attack, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down and completely blind. It was a lie Daniel himself had arranged, the only person outside his small circle of loyalty who knew the truth. Everyone else, from the guards to the kitchen staff to his own brother, believed the diagnosis completely. Word spread quickly through the estate that the great Daniel Hart, feared and respected by everyone who had ever crossed his path, was now nothing more than a shell of the man he used to be. Some of the staff began treating him with open pity, others with poorly hidden indifference, and a few, Daniel noticed with quiet anger, seemed almost relieved. It was strange to watch the world shift around him simply because it believed he could no longer see it shifting. His days settled into a careful, silent routine. He was wheeled from his bedroom to the sitting room each morning, positioned near the window as though he might enjoy the sunlight he supposedly could not see. Meals were brought to him and fed to him by whichever staff member drew the shortest straw that day, most of them rushing through the task with visible discomfort, eager to return to their other duties. Conversations happened around him as though he were a piece of furniture, and it was through these careless conversations that Daniel began collecting the first fragments of truth. It was on the 4th day of his return that he first noticed her. Grace Mallory was new to the household staff, hired only weeks before the attack to help manage the growing demands of the estate. She was different from the others in a way Daniel could not immediately explain. Where the other staff members handled him with stiff, reluctant hands, Grace moved with an ease that felt almost natural, as though caring for him was simply another part of her day, rather than an unpleasant chore to be endured. She spoke to him constantly, even though she believed he could not hear a word of it, filling the silence of the room with small observations about the weather, the garden, or the food she was preparing for him. At first, Daniel found her chatter mildly irritating, a distraction from his careful observation of everyone else in the house. But as the days passed, he began to notice something else in her voice, a warmth that seemed entirely genuine, untouched by pity or performance. One afternoon, as she guided a spoon of soup toward his mouth, she paused and said quietly that she hoped he was still in there somewhere, listening, even if his body could not respond. She said it not as a hopeful platitude meant for an audience, but as a private thought spoken only because she believed no one, including him, could hear it. Daniel felt something shift inside his chest, a strange discomfort he could not name, and for the first time since the attack, he wondered if he had misjudged how alone he truly was. Meanwhile, the household around him continued its quiet transformation. Victor began holding meetings in the study late at night, his voice low and careful, always ending abruptly whenever a servant walked too close to the door. Claire made frequent trips into the city, returning with new jewelry and new secrets, her smile a little too satisfied for a woman whose fiancé lay paralyzed and blind in the next room. Daniel listened to all of it from his wheelchair, cataloging every suspicious detail, piecing together a picture that grew darker with each passing day. He began to realize that his plan, born out of desperation in that small clinic 3 days after the attack, was working exactly as he had hoped. The vultures were beginning to circle, believing the carcass was already theirs to divide. But in the middle of all that quiet betrayal, one person continued to treat him not as a broken man to be managed, but as a person still worth caring for. And Daniel Hart, a man who had spent his entire life trusting no one, found himself unable to stop wondering who Grace Mallory really was, and why her kindness felt more dangerous to his carefully guarded heart than any bullet ever had. The days at the estate began to move with a strange, uneasy rhythm. On the surface, everything appeared calm. Meals were served on schedule, the gardens were trimmed, and guests came and went with polite smiles. But underneath that calm surface, Daniel Hart could feel the house shifting, piece by piece, like a structure being quietly hollowed out from the inside. Victor had taken over most of the daily decisions concerning the family business, something that would have been unthinkable only weeks earlier. Daniel listened as men he barely recognized came and went through the side entrance, their voices low, their meetings always ending the moment someone else entered the room. He could not see their faces, but he memorized their voices, their patterns of speech, the particular way certain men cleared their throats before delivering bad news. Every detail became a piece of a puzzle he was slowly assembling in the dark. Claire's behavior had changed as well, though she was far less careful than she believed herself to be. She often sat beside him in the evenings, holding his limp hand and speaking softly, for the benefit of anyone who might be watching, praising her own devotion to a man who could no longer respond. But the moment she believed they were alone, her tone shifted entirely. She spoke on the phone in hushed, urgent whispers, discussing accounts, properties, and signatures that needed to be arranged before certain deadlines passed. Daniel absorbed every word, storing it carefully, waiting for the full shape of her betrayal to reveal itself. It was Grace who remained the one constant thread of warmth running through his otherwise cold and calculating days. She arrived each morning with the same steady gentleness, humming softly as she opened the curtains, describing the color of the sky even though she believed he could not see it. She read to him from the newspaper, offering her own opinions on the articles as though inviting him into a conversation neither of them expected him to answer. At first, Daniel had assumed her kindness was simply part of her nature, a quality some people were fortunate enough to possess. But as time passed, he began to notice small things that did not fit so easily into that explanation. One evening, as she adjusted the blanket over his knees, her fingers brushed against a faint scar along his forearm, a mark left many years earlier during a violent dispute with a rival family. Grace paused, her breath catching for just a moment, and Daniel felt her hand tighten slightly before she continued her task, as though nothing had happened. It was a small reaction, barely noticeable, but Daniel had spent his entire life reading the subtle signals other people gave away without meaning to, and this one struck him as significant. He began paying closer attention to her after that, listening not just to what she said, but to what she chose not to say. She never asked questions about his past, even though most new staff members were naturally curious about the man they worked for. She never mentioned her own family, deflecting gently whenever another servant asked where she had grown up or what had brought her to the estate. Daniel found himself wondering, with a mixture of suspicion and reluctant admiration, whether Grace Mallory had arrived in his household for reasons that had nothing to do with finding honest work. Despite his growing curiosity, Daniel could not deny that her presence had become the only part of his day he looked forward to. The other staff members handled him with a kind of clinical detachment, their movements efficient but empty, their words minimal and often careless. He had overheard two of the younger maids joking quietly in the hallway about the vegetable upstairs, their laughter cutting through him more sharply than he expected. Grace, by contrast, spoke to him as though his mind were still fully present, still capable of understanding and feeling everything around him, which of course it was. One afternoon, while Grace believed him fully asleep, she sat beside his bed and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. She said she was sorry for a great many things. Sorry for choices that had brought her to this house. Sorry for the life that had shaped her into someone who had once believed hurting him might bring her peace. Daniel's pulse quickened beneath his still exterior, every instinct urging him to open his eyes and demand answers. But he forced himself to remain motionless, understanding that pushing too soon might close a door he desperately wanted to keep open. The following week, Victor arranged a private meeting with a lawyer in the study, his voice carrying just enough for Daniel to catch fragments of the conversation from his wheelchair in the hallway outside. Words like guardianship, incompetence, and permanent care facility drifted through the gap in the door, each one landing like a small blow. Daniel understood immediately what his brother intended. If Victor could convince a court that Daniel was mentally and physically incapable of managing his own affairs, control of the entire family business would pass legally into his hands, with Claire standing beside him as the grieving, devoted fiancée who had no choice but to step aside gracefully. Daniel felt a cold, familiar anger settle into his chest, the same anger that had once driven him to build an empire from nothing. But this time, he forced himself to remain calm, reminding himself that anger without patience was exactly the kind of weakness that had nearly gotten him killed. He needed evidence, not emotion. He needed proof that would hold up not just in a courtroom, but in the far less forgiving court of his own world, where betrayal was often answered with permanent consequences. That evening, Grace wheeled him into the garden for what she called a bit of fresh air, chatting easily about the roses that had just begun to bloom near the fountain. As she adjusted his chair to face the sunset, she paused and said something that caught him completely off guard. She mentioned, almost in passing, a name from years earlier, a man named Edward Cross, a name Daniel remembered clearly, as someone whose life and business had been destroyed during one of his earliest and most ruthless expansions. Daniel's mind raced beneath his calm exterior. Edward Cross had been a small but promising businessman decades ago, a man whose company Daniel had crushed without hesitation on his way to building his own empire. The man had lost everything, his business, his reputation, and eventually, from what Daniel vaguely recalled, his health as well. He had never once considered the ripple effects of that decision beyond the immediate business advantage it provided him. Hearing that name now, spoken so casually by the one person in his life who had shown him unexpected kindness, sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. He began replaying every interaction he had shared with Grace since her arrival, searching for confirmation of the suspicion now forming in his mind. her careful avoidance of questions about her past, her reaction to the scar on his arm, her whispered apology in the quiet of his bedroom. Piece by piece, the picture became clearer, though Daniel still lacked the final confirmation he needed. If Grace Mallory was somehow connected to Edward Cross, her presence in his household could not be simple coincidence. Yet even with this suspicion sitting heavily in his mind, Daniel found himself unwilling to view her the way he viewed everyone else circling his supposed downfall. Victor's ambition felt calculated and cold. Claire's devotion felt hollow and rehearsed. But Grace's kindness, even if it had begun with a hidden purpose, felt different somehow, tangled with something that resembled genuine conflict rather than simple deception. He wondered whether she had come to his household seeking revenge, only to find herself unable to carry it through, once faced with the reality of caring for him, day after day. The tension in the house continued building steadily. Victor grew bolder, arranging for a specialist to visit the estate and formally evaluate Daniel's condition, a clear step toward building the legal case for guardianship. Claire began quietly transferring smaller assets into accounts under her own name, believing herself clever enough to avoid detection. Daniel absorbed every development with outward stillness and inward calculation, aware that time was working against him. If Victor succeeded in having him declared legally incompetent, he could be removed from the estate entirely, placed under supervision that would make it nearly impossible for him to continue his quiet investigation, or to protect himself from whatever came next. Through it all, Grace remained by his side, seemingly unaware of the storm gathering around them both. She continued speaking to him with the same warmth, the same gentle humor, treating him as a person deserving of dignity even when everyone else in the house had already begun writing him off. Daniel found himself facing an uncomfortable truth. He no longer knew whether he was watching her to uncover a threat, or clinging to her presence because it was the only honest thing left in a house full of quiet, calculated lies. One night, unable to sleep despite the late hour, Daniel lay in the darkness of his room and listened as Grace moved quietly through the hallway outside, checking on him one final time before retiring for the evening. She paused at his door, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, simply standing there in the silence. Then, softly, she whispered that she hoped tomorrow would bring him some peace, whatever that meant for a man the world believed could no longer hear such wishes. Daniel closed his eyes, his mind turning over every possibility, every danger, every fragile thread of trust he had allowed himself to consider. Somewhere beyond these walls, his brother was building a case to strip him of everything he had built. Somewhere in that same house, his fiancée was quietly preparing to abandon him the moment it became profitable to do so. And somewhere between suspicion and hope, a woman named Grace Mallory was becoming the single unpredictable variable in a plan Daniel could no longer be certain he still fully controlled. The specialist arrived on a gray morning, a tall, thin man with a leather case and a clipboard, introduced to the household as an independent expert, brought in to confirm Daniel's condition for legal purposes. Daniel recognized immediately, from the careful way Victor greeted the man in the hallway, that this visit had been arranged not to help him, but to build a case against him. He sat perfectly still in his wheelchair as the specialist ran a series of tests, shining a light near his eyes, tapping gently at his knees, asking questions in a loud, deliberate voice, as though volume alone might restore function to a mind everyone assumed was no longer listening. Daniel forced his body to remain limp, his expression blank, even as every instinct screamed at him to react. It took every ounce of discipline he possessed to sit through the examination without flinching, without allowing even a flicker of awareness to cross his face. When the specialist finally left, murmuring quiet notes to Victor in the hallway, Daniel understood that the first formal piece of Victor's plan had just been set into motion. It would only be a matter of time before official paperwork began circulating, paperwork that could hand control of his empire to the very people trying to destroy him. That evening, Grace arrived to help him prepare for bed, her expression more subdued than usual. She mentioned, in a careful tone, that she had overheard some of the staff gossiping about changes coming to the household, about new arrangements being discussed for his care. She said it gently, testing the words as though gauging whether some part of him might understand the weight behind them. Daniel remained silent, as he always did, but something in her voice that night carried a genuine note of worry. one that seemed to extend beyond simple professional concern. Over the following days, Daniel decided it was time to learn the truth about Grace, even if doing so meant taking a small risk. He began leaving subtle openings in his supposed helplessness, small tests designed to reveal whether she was exactly who she claimed to be. One afternoon, he allowed his hand to twitch slightly when she mentioned Edward Cross again in passing, a movement so small it could easily be dismissed as an involuntary muscle spasm. He watched, through eyes barely open behind his dark glasses, as Grace froze completely, her hand hovering above his own, her breath caught in her throat. She did not call out for help. She did not immediately assume some miraculous medical recovery. Instead, she leaned closer, her voice trembling, as she asked quietly if he could hear her, if he understood anything she was saying. Daniel remained still, unwilling to reveal his full awareness just yet, but the moment told him everything he needed to know. Grace was not simply reacting with surprise. She was reacting with fear, the kind of fear that came from someone who had a secret worth protecting. The following morning, driven by a mixture of caution and an unfamiliar need for honesty, Grace began speaking to him differently. She no longer treated their one-sided conversations as casual chatter meant to fill silence. Instead, her words grew more personal, more confessional, as though she needed to release a burden she had carried for a long time. She told him, believing he still could not truly understand, about a father who had once run a modest but promising business, a company that had been swallowed and destroyed by a much larger, more ruthless competitor, decades earlier. She described watching her father's health decline in the years that followed, his spirit broken long before his body finally gave out. She spoke of growing up in the shadow of that failure, of the anger she had carried quietly for years, an anger that eventually led her to seek employment within Daniel Hart's own household under a different intention than simply earning a paycheck. She admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, that she had once believed causing him harm might somehow balance the scales of what her family had lost. Daniel listened to every word, his chest tightening with a complicated mixture of guilt and understanding he rarely allowed himself to feel. He had built his empire through decisions exactly like the one that had destroyed Edward Cross, decisions he had made without a second thought for the families left in the wreckage. Hearing the consequences of that choice now, spoken so openly by someone standing directly beside him, forced him to confront a part of his past he had spent years refusing to examine. Grace continued, her voice growing steadier as she explained that her plans had changed the moment she began caring for him after the attack. She had expected to find a man deserving of every bit of suffering she believed he had earned. Instead, she found someone entirely helpless, dependent on the very people circling him with far less honorable intentions than her own. She admitted that watching Victor's calculated ambition and Claire's cold indifference had changed something in her, revealing a version of loyalty and betrayal far more complicated than the simple revenge she had once imagined. Daniel felt his resolve waver as he listened, torn between the instinct to remain guarded and an unfamiliar desire to trust the one person who had shown him unwavering care throughout this entire ordeal. He understood, with painful clarity, that Grace held enough knowledge to expose his secret entirely, either intentionally or by accident, and yet some part of him no longer viewed that possibility as the greatest danger facing him. Meanwhile, Victor's plans accelerated with troubling speed. A formal hearing was scheduled to determine guardianship over Daniel's affairs, set to take place within the week at a private location arranged by the family's own lawyers, far from any public courtroom that might attract unwanted attention. Daniel understood that if this hearing proceeded as Victor intended, with a compromised specialist's report and Claire's tearful testimony of devotion, the outcome would almost certainly favor his brother's ambitions. Claire, growing increasingly confident in her assumed victory, became careless in ways that worked directly in Daniel's favor. She began making phone calls from rooms she assumed were private, discussing details of accounts already being quietly transferred, properties being valued for eventual sale, and a timeline for when she and Victor intended to finalize their control over the business entirely. Daniel, positioned nearby in his wheelchair on more than one occasion, absorbed every detail, understanding that these careless conversations were quickly becoming the foundation of evidence he would eventually need. One evening, as tension in the house reached a breaking point, Grace made a decision that surprised even herself. Rather than continuing to carry her secret alone, she chose to test the boundaries of her own uncertainty, speaking directly and clearly, without the protective assumption that he could not understand her. She asked him plainly, her voice trembling slightly, whether there was any part of him capable of hearing her, capable of responding in whatever way remained possible. Daniel considered his options carefully, weighing the risk of revealing even a fraction of the truth against the growing urgency of the situation building around him. He understood that Victor's hearing was approaching quickly, and that facing it without an ally inside the house, someone who could help him gather evidence and protect his interests when he could not act openly himself, would leave him dangerously exposed. Slowly, deliberately, he allowed his fingers to close gently around her hand, a small but unmistakable gesture of response. Grace gasped softly, pulling back for a moment in stunned disbelief, before leaning closer again, searching his face for further confirmation. Daniel, still cautious but no longer willing to remain entirely hidden from her, allowed a faint nod, careful and slow, enough to answer her question without fully revealing the extent of his deception. It was a small crack in the wall he had built, but it was enough to change everything between them. Grace's reaction was not one of anger at having been kept in the dark, as Daniel might have expected. Instead, relief washed visibly over her features, followed quickly by a fierce, protective determination. She whispered that she understood now why he had allowed the household to believe him broken, and that regardless of what she had once intended when she arrived at this estate, she had no interest in seeing him destroyed by people far less honest than either of them had ever been with each other. Over the following nights, working carefully and quietly to avoid raising suspicion among the rest of the household, Grace became an unexpected partner in Daniel's careful investigation. She relayed conversations she overheard among the staff, details about visitors arriving late at night, and fragments of Victor's private discussions that reached her through the natural invisibility granted to household help. Daniel, in turn, began sharing pieces of his own observations, guiding her attention toward specific details that might strengthen the evidence he needed before Victor's hearing arrived. Despite the growing partnership forming between them, Daniel remained aware that time was working against him. The hearing loomed only days away, and with it came a growing sense that whatever advantage he still held through his secret awareness would soon be tested in ways far more dangerous than careful observation alone. Somewhere in the house, his brother continued preparing to seize everything Daniel had built, confident that a broken man in a wheelchair posed no real threat to his ambitions. Daniel intended to make certain that confidence became Victor's greatest and final mistake. The morning of the hearing arrived faster than Daniel had hoped, gray clouds hanging low over the estate as though the sky itself understood the weight of what was about to unfold. He sat in his wheelchair near the window of his room, listening to the sound of cars arriving outside, their doors closing with quiet, deliberate precision. Victor had arranged everything with careful attention to detail, ensuring that the lawyers, the specialist, and a small group of trusted witnesses would all be present to finalize what he believed was already a certain outcome. Grace entered the room shortly after, her expression tense but composed, having spent the previous nights gathering every piece of information she could without drawing attention to herself. She had discovered through a conversation overheard near the kitchen the evening before that Victor intended to have Daniel moved that very afternoon to a private facility outside the city, a place designed to keep him isolated from anyone who might question the guardianship arrangement once it became official. The moment the papers were signed, Daniel would effectively disappear from the world he had built, replaced entirely by the brother who had once claimed to love him. Daniel listened to this news with a calm that masked the urgency building beneath his still exterior. He understood that once he was removed from the estate, gathering further evidence or defending himself in any meaningful way would become almost impossible. Whatever plan he intended to use, it needed to happen before the hearing concluded, not after. Grace, sensing his tension despite his outward stillness, asked quietly what she could do to help, her voice steady despite the fear evident in her eyes. The hearing began in the main hall shortly before noon, the room arranged with a long table where Victor sat beside a team of lawyers, Claire positioned beside him with an expression of practiced sorrow. The specialist who had examined Daniel days earlier presented his findings, describing in confident clinical language a condition that left no room, according to his professional opinion, for any meaningful recovery. Victor spoke next, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a grieving brother forced into an impossible position, explaining that he had no choice but to step forward and protect the family business during his brother's incapacity. Daniel sat silently in his wheelchair near the edge of the room, positioned exactly where Victor wanted him, a visual reminder of helplessness meant to reinforce every word being spoken. He listened as the lawyers moved through the necessary legal language, preparing the final documents that would transfer control of everything he had built into his brother's hands. The moment felt suffocating, each passing minute bringing him closer to a future he refused to accept without resistance. It was at this exact moment, as the final papers were being placed in front of Victor for signature, that Grace entered the room carrying a small tray, playing her part as household staff bringing refreshments to the gathered guests. No one paid her much attention as she moved quietly around the table, exactly as Daniel had instructed her the night before. She placed a folder discreetly beside the lead lawyer's briefcase, a folder containing copies of financial records she and Daniel had carefully compiled over the past several nights, records detailing the unauthorized transfers Claire had been making from the family accounts. Daniel understood that revealing this evidence through Grace alone would not be enough. The lawyers, loyal to whoever paid them, might simply dismiss the documents or bury them entirely if given the chance. He needed to act directly, and he needed to do it now, before the signatures were finalized and his fate sealed beyond recovery. Taking a slow breath, Daniel made the decision he had been building toward since the night of the attack that started everything. He straightened in his wheelchair, removed the dark glasses from his face with a steady hand, and spoke clearly for the first time since his supposed injury, his voice calm but carrying enough authority to silence the entire room instantly. Every head turned toward him in stunned disbelief, Victor's face draining of color as the reality of the situation crashed over him. Daniel explained, without raising his voice, that he had never lost his sight or his ability to move, and that every conversation held in this house over the past several weeks had been heard and understood clearly. The room fell into chaos almost immediately. Victor rose from his chair, stammering explanations that grew increasingly desperate, as Daniel calmly directed the lead lawyer's attention to the folder Grace had placed only minutes earlier. The financial records inside told a clear story, one that even the most loyal lawyer could not easily dismiss, detailing months of unauthorized transfers, moving steadily from the family accounts into holdings controlled by Claire alone. Claire's composed expression shattered instantly, replaced by panic, as she realized her carelessness had finally caught up with her. Victor attempted to regain control of the situation, insisting that Daniel's sudden recovery proved nothing about his fitness to continue managing the business, suggesting instead that this was simply another manipulation designed to protect his position. But Daniel, prepared for exactly this kind of resistance, calmly revealed additional evidence gathered over the previous weeks, recordings of private conversations overheard through household staff, timelines documenting the specialist's compromised examination, and detailed notes matching Victor's private meetings with unfamiliar men to specific dates when critical business decisions had mysteriously shifted in his favor. The lawyers, faced with undeniable evidence of fraud and manipulation, quickly distanced themselves from Victor's plan, unwilling to risk their own reputations by continuing to support a guardianship built on false medical claims and financial deception. The specialist, confronted directly about the inconsistencies in his examination, grew visibly nervous, eventually admitting under pressure that he had been paid generously to falsify certain aspects of his report in exchange for future business considerations once Victor assumed control. Grace stood quietly near the edge of the room throughout this unfolding confrontation, watching as the careful plan she and Daniel had built together finally came into full view. She felt a strange mixture of relief and lingering uncertainty, aware that revealing her own involvement in gathering this evidence might expose secrets she had not yet fully shared with Daniel, particularly regarding her original reasons for joining this household in the first place. As the chaos in the room began to settle, Victor's desperation reached a dangerous peak. Realizing that his careful plan had completely unraveled, he made one final attempt to salvage his position, turning toward Daniel with an expression that had abandoned any pretense of brotherly concern. He accused Daniel openly of deception and betrayal, insisting that a man capable of such elaborate manipulation could never truly be trusted by anyone, family included. Daniel absorbed the accusation calmly, understanding that Victor's words, though intended as an attack, carried an uncomfortable grain of truth about the world they had both been raised in. Rather than responding with anger, Daniel addressed the room with a steady, measured tone, acknowledging openly that his deception had been born from necessity rather than malice, a direct response to an attack that had nearly ended his life weeks earlier. He reminded everyone present that the true betrayal in this house had not come from a man protecting himself from those trying to destroy him, but from a brother and a fiancé willing to exploit his vulnerability for personal gain, the moment they believed him incapable of defending himself. The hearing dissolved shortly afterward, the lawyers withdrawing their support entirely, leaving Victor and Claire exposed without the legal protection they had been counting on. Security personnel, quietly summoned by Daniel through a signal arranged with Grace earlier that morning, arrived to escort both Victor and Claire from the premises, their earlier confidence replaced entirely by the realization that their carefully constructed plan had collapsed in a matter of minutes. As the room emptied and the tension slowly began to fade, Daniel turned toward Grace, who remained standing quietly near the doorway, uncertain of what might happen now that the truth had fully surfaced. He studied her carefully, aware that despite everything they had built together over these past difficult weeks, an important piece of honesty still remained unspoken between them. He asked her directly, his voice softer now than it had been during the confrontation, whether she still intended to share the rest of her story, the parts she had not yet fully revealed. Grace hesitated only briefly before nodding, understanding that the trust they had built through shared danger deserved nothing less than complete honesty in return. She confirmed what Daniel had already suspected, that her connection to Edward Cross ran deeper than a distant acquaintance, that she was, in fact, his daughter, raised in the shadow of a ruin Daniel himself had once caused without a second thought. She explained again, more clearly this time, how her original intentions upon joining his household had been shaped by anger and a desire for a kind of justice she no longer believed would bring her any peace. Daniel listened without interruption, absorbing the full weight of her honesty, with a quiet humility, unfamiliar to a man who had spent his life avoiding vulnerability of any kind. He acknowledged, openly and without excuse, the damage his earlier decisions had caused, not just to Edward Cross, but to the family left to endure the consequences long after the business itself had been forgotten. It was not an easy admission for a man like Daniel Hart, but it was one he understood, needed to be made honestly, if anything real was going to grow between them moving forward. Grace, moved by the sincerity in his acknowledgement, admitted that somewhere between her original plan and the reality of caring for him through his darkest days, her anger had transformed into something she had never expected to feel toward the man responsible for her family's downfall. She did not excuse what he had done in his past, but she recognized, perhaps more clearly than anyone else in his life, the difference between the ruthless man who once destroyed her father's business and the man who had chosen honesty and vulnerability when it mattered most. As evening settled over the estate, the immediate danger finally cleared. Daniel understood that while Victor and Claire had been exposed, the consequences of their actions and the full restoration of his authority over the business still remained unfinished. Yet for the first time since the attack that had upended his entire life, he felt something closer to genuine hope than calculated survival, standing beside a woman who had every reason to hate him, yet chose instead to help him reclaim everything that had nearly been taken away. In the weeks that followed the collapse of Victor's plan, the estate slowly began returning to a version of normal life, though nothing about it felt quite the same as before the attack that had changed everything. Daniel resumed control of the family business with a quiet, deliberate authority, moving carefully to repair relationships with partners and associates who had grown uncertain during the period of his supposed incapacity. Word spread quickly through his world that Daniel Hart had not only survived an assassination attempt, but had outmaneuvered those closest to him with a patience and precision that left even his most seasoned rivals impressed, and in some cases, deeply unsettled. Victor, stripped of any legal claim to the family's holdings, found himself facing consequences far beyond simple embarrassment. The financial records exposed during the hearing revealed a pattern of decisions that had quietly damaged several long-standing business relationships. Decisions made in Daniel's name while he had been assumed incapable of noticing. Partners who had once respected Victor's judgment now viewed him with open suspicion, unwilling to trust a man who had so easily attempted to seize control through deception rather than earned leadership. Daniel made the decision to remove Victor entirely from any involvement in the business, a separation that came without dramatic confrontation, delivered instead through a calm, final conversation that left no room for negotiation or return. Claire's downfall proved even swifter. The unauthorized transfers documented in the evidence Daniel and Grace had gathered together were enough to end not only her engagement to Daniel, but her standing within the social circles she had spent years carefully cultivating. She left the estate quietly within days of the hearing, her earlier confidence replaced by a quiet understanding that her carelessness had cost her far more than she had ever anticipated gaining. Daniel felt no satisfaction in her departure, only a distant recognition that he had once again misjudged the true intentions of someone he had allowed close to his life. With the immediate threats resolved, Daniel found himself facing a different kind of challenge, one far less familiar than navigating betrayal within his own household. He needed to decide what role Grace would continue to play in his life, now that the danger that had originally brought them together had passed. She remained on staff throughout those first weeks, continuing her daily routines with the same quiet dedication she had shown from the very beginning, though the easy warmth between them had grown into something neither of them fully acknowledged aloud. One evening, as the estate settled into a calm, quiet dusk, Daniel found Grace in the garden near the same fountain where she had once mentioned Edward Cross for the first time, a conversation that had set so much of their shared story into motion. He approached slowly, no longer confined to the wheelchair that had defined their relationship for so many weeks, and stood beside her in comfortable silence for a long moment before speaking. He told her plainly that he had spent years surrounding himself with people who valued his position far more than they valued him as a person, and that her honesty, even when it had been difficult to hear, meant more to him than any loyalty he had ever purchased or demanded. Grace listened carefully, aware that this conversation carried a weight beyond simple gratitude. She admitted in turn that she had come to this house expecting to find confirmation of everything she believed about the man responsible for her father's ruin, yet had instead discovered someone far more complicated, someone capable of both the ruthlessness that had shaped her family's suffering and the vulnerability that had ultimately earned her trust. She acknowledged that letting go of years of quiet resentment had not been easy, but that continuing to carry it forward no longer felt like justice, only a burden neither of them needed to keep. Daniel, unaccustomed to expressing sentiment so openly, chose his words carefully, telling her that he did not expect forgiveness for choices made long before she had ever entered his life, but that he hoped, given time, they might build something together that had nothing to do with debts owed or wrongs to be corrected. He explained that watching her defend him when she had every reason to abandon him, and later, choosing honesty over continued deception once the truth surfaced, had shown him a kind of integrity he had rarely encountered in the world he inhabited. Grace smiled softly, admitting that she had not expected to feel anything close to affection for a man she had once viewed only as an enemy. Yet somewhere between the long nights of quiet care and the shared danger of exposing Victor's betrayal, that view had shifted entirely. She told him she no longer saw him as the powerful, distant figure feared throughout his world, but simply as Daniel, a man who had shown her more genuine respect during his supposed helplessness than most people had offered her throughout her entire life. In the months that followed, Daniel made a deliberate choice to change the way he ran his household and his business, no longer surrounding himself with people motivated purely by ambition or fear, but instead rebuilding his inner circle around loyalty, earned through honesty rather than obligation. He elevated Grace's role within his life gradually, not as a gesture of debt repayment, but as a genuine recognition of the partnership that had formed between them during the most dangerous period of his life. She became, in time, someone he consulted openly on matters far beyond household management, her steady judgment proving valuable in ways neither of them had anticipated when she first arrived seeking a very different kind of resolution. Word eventually reached other players within Daniel's world about the manner in which he had reclaimed his position, not through brute force or violent retaliation, but through patience, careful observation, and an unexpected willingness to trust someone who had every reason to work against him. This reputation, unusual within a world that typically rewarded ruthlessness above all else, brought Daniel a level of respect he had not previously commanded, respect built not on fear, but on the recognition that he was a man capable of both strength and genuine loyalty. Victor, having lost his standing within the family business entirely, eventually left the city, choosing to build a quieter life, far removed from the world that had once defined his ambitions. Daniel made no further attempts to pursue additional consequences against his brother, understanding that Victor's public downfall and loss of everything he had tried to seize served as consequence enough. Claire, similarly, faded from the social circles she had once dominated, her reputation permanently damaged by the exposed betrayal that had ended both her engagement and her financial ambitions in a single afternoon. As for Daniel and Grace, their relationship continued to grow steadily, built on a foundation neither expected when their paths first crossed under such complicated circumstances. Daniel found himself, for the first time in his adult life, genuinely looking forward to quiet evenings spent simply talking with someone who valued him beyond his position or his wealth. Grace, in turn, discovered a peace she had not known was possible, having finally released the anger she carried for so many years, in favor of a relationship built on mutual respect and hard-earned trust. On a clear evening nearly a year after the attack that had set everything into motion, Daniel gathered a small group of close associates and staff members within the estate to formally announce a new chapter in both his personal life and his business affairs. Standing beside Grace, no longer as household staff, but as his acknowledged partner in both life and the careful decisions guiding his future, Daniel spoke openly about the lessons learned during the darkest weeks of his life, lessons about loyalty, deception, and the surprising strength found in genuine kindness, offered without expectation of reward. Grace stood proudly beside him, no longer the quiet maid who had once entered his household carrying secret resentment and uncertain intentions, but a woman fully recognized for the courage and integrity she had shown throughout their shared ordeal. Those who had once dismissed her as simply another member of the household staff now understood clearly the vital role she had played in helping Daniel reclaim everything that had nearly been stolen from him, and the deep bond that had formed between them through honesty forged in the most difficult of circumstances. As the gathering came to a close, and the estate settled once again into peaceful evening quiet, Daniel reflected on how close he had come to losing everything, not just his business, but any real chance at genuine connection with another person. The attack that had once seemed like the darkest moment of his life had, in the end, revealed the truth about everyone around him, stripping away false loyalty and empty devotion to leave only the one person who had never truly abandoned him, even when she believed he could neither see nor hear the quiet kindness she offered every single day. In Grace, Daniel had found not just an ally who helped him reclaim his empire, but a partner who had shown him, for the first time in his life, what genuine loyalty truly looked like.